All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello all and welcome to our webinar, State Level Energy Policy Analysis in the Era of the Inflation Reduction Act, hosted by RMI and Energy Innovation. Thank you all for joining us to talk about the launch of the latest version of the Energy Policy Simulator and explore how it can be used for state-level climate action planning. My name is Kaylee Rubin, and I am an associate at RMI. During the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A function to drop any notes or questions that you may have. We will be reserving 15 minutes at the end to answer those questions. This webinar will be 60 minutes long. We will begin with some opening remarks from Jessica Lubetsky, and then I will turn it over to Nathan Iyer and Olivia Ashmore to give a more in-depth analysis of our models and a demonstration on how to use them. First, I would like to welcome Jessica Lubetsky from the Energy Foundation. She is a program director at the Energy Foundation, where she leads strategic and impactful campaigns to advance climate policy at the federal and state levels. Jessica has over 20 years of experience in policy research and communications, and she is passionate about using her abilities to empower staff and collaborate with stakeholders to achieve policies that benefit people and the planet. And with that, I would like to welcome Jessica.
Thank you, Kaylee. First off, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and to the RMI and EI team for putting this together. It's going to be a great presentation, so thank you. We at Energy Foundation are grateful to be supporting RMI and this work in the modeling to show not only how to make these models even better and iterate on them, but to also keep them highly accessible to folks like yourselves. These models help stakeholders get on the same page. They give the opportunity for folks to play around in policymaking and understand what happens when different decisions are made. Making models more accessible and allowing for improved data-based policymaking allows us all to benefit from the excellent policies that will be passed and implemented in the future. But it takes the research now to really understand what those should be and how they should be implemented to benefit not just a particular group of people, but really everyone out there, and make the most accessible, transparent, and equitable policies possible. We're really excited about some of the uses that we've already seen from the EPS model and from the work that you're about to see. We've seen state officials using these models to test ideas and create plans like the climate pollution reduction grant programs, priority action plans that have already been turned in, and I'm sure many state officials are using them in their comprehensive plans as well that we'll be seeing over the next year or so. It's been also really helpful for advocates out there to use these types of models to identify policy opportunities that are highly ambitious while also highly within reach. So what can we really do, and what can we help states accomplish right now that offers significant carbon pollution reductions while also benefiting the economy and improving the lives of all residents and citizens and everyone within the states? Thanks so much, Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Now to formally introduce the new and improved Energy Policy Simulator and explain how it can be used, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia Ashmore and Nathan Iyer. Olivia is a senior policy analyst at Energy Innovation focused on modeling and analysis. She provides research and analysis to support Energy Innovation's climate policy modeling. And Nathan is a technical manager with the U.S. program at RMI. He focuses on federal and state climate policy modeling and implementation. And Nathan has helped build state-level policy simulator tools to support effective subnational climate in partnership with Energy Innovation.
Thanks, Kaylee. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia from Energy Innovation. I'm really excited you all are joining us today to learn about the updated energy policy simulator tools. I'm just going to briefly walk through how the EPS works and then just talk about some new features of the updated tool, and then hand it over to Nathan to talk about some exciting use cases of the state EPS models. Next slide. So our big picture goal with the EPS is to help users make data-informed choices. We want policy advocates and policymakers to be able to understand the impacts of energy and environmental policies. We want them to be able to use our tool to find the best ways to meet their climate, financial, and other goals, and to make policy decisions that are unbiased and data supported. So in order to do this, RMI and Energy Innovation came together with the idea of supporting state-level climate action and developed 48 state energy policy simulators. Next slide. The EPS, Energy Policy Simulator, is an economy-wide model of a state's energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. It allows users to build policy scenarios and combine different policies to meet their goals. It allows you to see the impacts of individual and aggregate policies on the state's economy, emissions, and public health. And the model will run in real time. You can see the results within minutes and use it both in a web tool version or on a downloaded version. You can download the software and use it on your computer. It's really important to both of our organizations that the tool is free, public, open source, and easy to use. So the EPS uses publicly available data, primarily from government sources. It's open source. You can download the tool in its entirety, including the model code and all the underlying data. It's trustworthy, or we try to make it as trustworthy as possible. We've had the model peer reviewed by other organizations, and we're transparent in our methods. There's documentation online that explains how the tool works in great detail. Next slide. So how does the EPS work? We start off by building a business as usual forecast. To do this, we primarily rely on data from other government agencies. So primarily for the states, that's NREL, EIA, and EPA. We take in 2021 historical data from these sources, as well as forecasts through 2050. And then we feed those into the model to create a forecast of energy use and emissions. We also use current and future costs and prices. This allows us to take into account changing prices for things like fossil fuels and construction costs for different electricity capacity resources. This allows the model to make some decisions based on least cost. So for example, when building a new electricity capacity, the model can take into account the construction cost and levelized cost of energy and choose what capacity is cheapest and deploy that in the tool. The model is economy-wide, so it covers industry, buildings, transportation, land use, and electricity. And once we have our economy-wide BAU forecast, we can start to look at the impact of different policies. So users can apply policies, either one or multiple, and create a policy scenario. We then compare the difference between the policy scenario and the business as usual to generate policy impacts, which show us changes between things like the economy, emissions, and public health outputs. The policies in the tool have built-in assumptions. So for example, if you use one of the policy levers to subsidize EVs, the model is going to estimate the change in consumer choices associated with a lower EV price. Next slide. So to accurately represent the combined effects of multiple policies, we use a system dynamics model. This can account for policy interactions in real time because policies can affect each other, either amplifying or dampening effects. So for example, imagine a scenario where you apply both energy efficiency and a clean electricity grid at the same time. These policies on their own could each yield 1 metric ton of emissions reductions, but together they're actually going to be a little less because the improvements in the clean electricity sector are offsetting some of the potential improvements that you could have had with energy efficiency if the electricity was still coming from dirty sources. The opposite is also true, so policy interactions can amplify effects. For example, if you have a clean electricity grid and add more EVs at the same time, your EVs are going to have more reductions than they would have otherwise because they're now running on cleaner electricity. Next slide. Okay, I'm now going to turn to highlighting some new exciting features of the model. So when the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, was passed, we had some policies in the IRA that we couldn't accurately represent in our old version of the EPS tool. So we decided to make several improvements to EPS to better capture the impact of IRA policies. I'm just going to run through a few examples and then talk in detail about the electricity sector. So the first example, IRA incentivized EV battery production. So we redesigned our model structure to calculate the prices of batteries and then the resulting impact on electric vehicle prices. The IRA generated new tax credits to incentivize the use of carbon capture and storage. So we added the ability to have cost-driven power plant retrofits so existing fossil fuel plants could adopt CCS. The IRA also included guidelines about hydrogen and how it needs to be produced to qualify for the hydrogen production tax credit. So to model this, we added new hydrogen production pathways, including blue hydrogen and green hydrogen using dedicated clean electricity. And then the biggest change was to overhaul the electricity sector to better represent incentives in the IRA and to capture new policies. I'll go into that in more detail. Next slide. We also updated the models with the latest historical data. So the models now include 2021 historical data from EIA and EPA. It includes updated growth forecasts from the Annual Energy Outlook 2023. We updated the power plant cost data from NREL's ATB 2024. And we updated the state models with major state policies passed through this year, including the clean electricity standards, clean vehicle standards, like advanced clean cars or trucks, carbon pricing, and EV subsidies. And then we folded IRA and IIJA policies into the business as usual case. So all of those policies are now embedded in the business as usual. Next slide. So to model the IRA, we completely overhauled our electricity sector and added some really exciting new features. The first is that we moved from an annual to an hourly electricity demand model. We now use 6 days to look at hourly electricity demand. We use 4, one from each season, and then we use a peak winter day and a peak summer day. This really improved our ability to model reliability, both for peak days and make sure we have enough capacity to meet reliability needs in every hour. We now have cost-driven capacity expansion. So the old version of the tool primarily built new capacity to meet demand. The new version of the tool will look at the expected revenue of power plant types, and if they're economic, it'll deploy those power plants. We also account for cost-effective retrofits to CCS. We use economic-driven retirements of existing plants, and then we have economically driven battery deployment now. So in the old version of the tool, batteries wouldn't deploy economically, and now we have batteries being deployed economically in the tool along with solar and wind. To best model the IRA, we also included several new power plant types. These include coal with CCS plant, natural gas with CCS, biomass with CCS, nuclear small modular reactors, and then hydrogen combustion turbines and combined cycle plants. All of these new features have allowed us to generate several new outputs like this graph on the slide to the right, which is a model of hourly electricity demand in an average summer day. And we also can produce outputs like a bottom-up estimate of retail electricity prices. This concludes my overview of 4.0 updates. One more slide. I just want to note we've already gotten some concerns from active EPS users saying that they're worried about accessing the old version of the tool and their saved scenarios And I just want to reassure you that you can still access the old 3.4.3 version of the tool on the model documentation page, which I can show you in our demo. And all your saved scenarios should transfer over to 4.0 under your account. So everything should still be available, and feel free to contact us if you have any concerns about that. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my partner, Nathan, who's going to talk about state EPS model uses.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And it's been an absolute pleasure working with Energy Innovation over the past 3 years to pull together all of this data and really build out this tool. I think that it's a really special partnership that we have to try to really use the analytical firepower for both organizations to make these insights public and more accessible. That's something that we at RMI really believe in. But right now, we've gone through some of the technical details of the tool, and I'm going to discuss a little bit of how you can actually use the EPS, how we've used it in the past, how it can be used in the future by both organizations like ours, partners, and folks in government agencies in making decisions. One relevant way, which is on the slide in front of you, is that EPS can be used to support state level implementation of IRA or Inflation Reduction Act programs. And one example is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, which requires both planning and implementation grants and plans on the state level in order to receive and use this funding. And so in particular, by mid-2025, a comprehensive climate action plan across the vast majority of states will be required to quantify emissions reduction measures and to provide an up-to-date inventory. And this is one place where the EPS can be very useful as a free open source tool to help supplement some of that effort. Next slide, please. So each comprehensive climate action plan, for example, must be submitted with a number of specific elements. And you can see to the right that those include an up-to-date greenhouse gas inventory, so figuring out where your emissions are coming from, GHG emissions projection, so where you expect emissions to go based on some assumptions, GHG reduction target, so setting sort of a future goal across a number of sectors or across the economy, quantify GHG reduction measures, so finding different measures that add up to that given target, and benefits analysis, so trying to figure out not only what are the benefits to emissions reductions, but also to the state economy, to health, and to other co-benefits that energy policy can lead to. And so for all of those pieces, the EPS does have features that can support this kind of decision-making. You can think of it as an effort to kind of gather all of these pieces and create a tool that really enables that projection, target setting, emissions measures, evaluation, and benefits analysis in a high-level scoping tool. And we'll go through some of those briefly, but I think that the important point here is that the EPS is not here to supplement or completely eliminate, agency work, advocate work, or other modeling work, but instead it's designed to raise the bar. So if you don't have to spend 3 weeks, 2 months, 6 months gathering all of this data, doing all of this analysis, trying to piece together those interactive effects, you can spend more time on some of the harder, more bespoke, state-specific issues that maybe require more firepower, including thinking about low-income communities, thinking about how do you socialize, how do you design these policies, how do you gain authorities to actually implement these. The things that are really important for policymakers and advocates can spend more time working on those, and then allow for some of these tools to kind of speed up the process of some of the more routine analytical work that underpins some of these decisions. So next slide, please. So diving into kind of how the EPS can be used for the inventory and projection side of things. To the right here, you can see one of approximately 60 or 70 EPS visualizations. And this is kind of a stacked line graph that demonstrates sort of from 2021 out to 2050, the emissions projections across a number of different sectors. And I want to highlight that very first year. That first year, we spent most of our time working on and calibrating to the most up-to-date EPA, EIA, and NREL data, so that publicly available data set to make sure that the model is starting with a calibrated and state-specific view of where emissions are coming from, where the energy is driving emissions, and how that can change over time. And you can kind of see in the projection that some sectors are reducing emissions while others are not. And that can help advocates and decision makers pinpoint sort of where progress is being made and where more progress can happen. But I think that that first calibration point is a really important one, because if anyone here who has worked deeply with emissions inventories know that that process can be a bit of an effort, because there's a lot of different inventories. Sometimes the state inventory and the EPA inventory don't align. Sometimes the energy data and the emissions data don't align. And so there is an error bar to any inventory that exists, regardless of who it's from. And so what we're trying to do here is sort of pull together all of those data points into a solid mid case, and to create analysis for insights, not necessarily for one specific data point, although we do try to force align as much as possible to the EPA inventories. So it provides that kind of that scoping view of where the emissions are and where they're going, which can be very helpful for considering order of magnitude impact of different interventions. Next slide, please. So speaking of interventions, one of the major uses of the EPS is translating targets into action plans. And to the left, you can see a number of different scenarios that are available. And this is the national model, but you can see that black scenario in the center. And that's kind of our business as usual, our current policy scenarios. That includes all of the layered policies that have been passed to date, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the IIJA, and on the state level, major state level policies. Above that, you can kind of see a benchmark to sort of if no policies were passed. So you can kind of see the progress made to date. And that green line is actually a scenario that we built to try to achieve a specific policy or a specific target. My apologies. And this is actually a very important exercise, because oftentimes targets are economy wide, they're sort of high level, and it takes a while to sort of translate that into very specific and time-bound subsectoral strategies. And so when you're designing policy scenarios, and you can design many, however many you want, to achieve a given target, you're forced to actually go in and say, okay, I need to know exactly how far we need to push, for example, electrification of transportation, and on what time scale in order to achieve this target. And the same thing goes for every single subsector that's available in the EPS. And at the end of this target setting process, you don't just necessarily have a target and how fast you need to go, but you also have a set of actions, a set of very tangible, time-bound, and quantifiable actions that are required to achieve that target. And so it converts it from a high-level idea into an actionable roadmap. And the same is true the other way. You can kind of use that bottom-up approach to set the target you believe is most applicable to your advocacy group or to your state. And so, this conversion between bottom up and top down, and that connection between the details and the high level, we believe is a major use case for identifying and pinpointing which sectors and subsectors are on track and which sectors and subsectors need more effort. Next slide, please. And we've done this work across a number of states with older models, and we look forward to continuing it with the newest 4.0 version. We have been able to evaluate and calculate which are the strategies and interventions that are most impactful across all of the 48 states that we have models for. And what we've seen when we're using the EPS to evaluate which policies have the largest emissions impact is that it actually is different across a number of states based on where emissions come from. So you can see to the right here, we sort of did this mapping exercise of what is the most important strategy for reducing emissions in a number of different states. And it's not the same across the board. Some states it's electricity, others it's buildings, others it's industry, or transportation as the second best. So there's a number of different options of where putting time and effort can lead to the most amount of emissions reductions, and being able to scope that out and figure it out and say, actually, this is our number one priority for emissions reductions, or our number one opportunity, at least, for each state, can really provide a much more granular sense of priority, which we find to be useful when dealing with sort of the complexity of the energy and emissions systems. Next slide, please. But we don't just have to use the EPS and the web apps, even though, as I mentioned before, there's 60 plus visualizations, enough to make any analyst happy for a very long time. but you can also use the foundational data to build into more analysis that's useful for whatever project you're working on. And I wanted to provide this one example that we at RMI had gotten a lot of traction on because it ends up being relatively important to our other core work streams, where we used EPS scenarios that we built out for a climate-aligned system to figure out how much Inflation Reduction Act federal dollars flow to specific states. So we were able to use that to figure out, how much deployment of EVs, how much deployment of clean energy, to convert that to real federal dollars. How much of the bill will the federal government pick up for the state, and therefore what is the size of the prize for economic development? And what we found using this EPS breakdown is that the flow of federal dollars does not look the same across states in terms of overall magnitude and overall opportunity, but it also looks different based on which sectors are receiving most of the dollars. And we were able to kind of use this macro system to kind of scope out, okay, for some states, it looks like electricity is the major prize in terms of IRA economic development. And for others, like Louisiana at the bottom, industry is kind of the major opportunity, and it kind of shifts across states. So this kind of work takes something that is sort of, left in the inventories or left in the projections world and converts it into very actionable and relevant insights by downloading that data and building on top of it, and something we're very excited about. But this is just a small handful of analysis and insights that we've used with the EPS. Frankly, this is, again, a foundational tool, open source, to be a jumping ground for creativity. And we've used it for all sorts of things, from evaluating the energy standards to evaluating electricity vehicle standards and how fast certain sectors can move. There's a wide abundance of opportunity to use this tool to better understand the energy system and to create more evidence-based strategies. So with that, I know we've been talking about the EPS for so long, might as well dive into it. Olivia, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm just going to provide a little demo of the tool. Let me share my screen here. All right. So this is our state EPS landing page. It's energypolicy.solutions/US states. From here, you can access the 48 state models by clicking in a state or clicking on the name here. I also just want to point out a link to our documentation, which is in this upper right-hand corner, docs. This provides some detailed instructions on how to download and use EPS, as well as our documentation of how the tool's methodology works. And then under model regions, we include a state EPS methodology, which includes the specific assumptions we made when generating the forecasts for the state EPS models, as well as how we modeled the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. And then underneath these model region state-specific pages, there's some version history and documentation, but we also have this button where you can download the tool in its entirety. So when we said open source, we want you to be able to download all the underlying data as well as the Venson code for the tool. So you can do that here. And then click here to access the old version of the model. So if you want to keep using the old version before it was updated this week, you can continue to access that through here. I pulled up the Pennsylvania model to share with you all. This is going to be the first page you see, and I uploaded the NDC scenario already for us to look at. This black line here is our business as usual forecast, which bakes in the state policy and the federal policy into that forecast. And then this green line is our NDC scenario, which was a scenario we developed for the US to meet the NDC targets, and then we applied to the states, just like as an example, so you can see what different policies can look like and different policy packages. If a state has greenhouse gas reduction targets, we've done our best to include those in this homepage graph here. And so then I'm just going to go through and highlight several exciting graphs that you can use to look at different policy outputs and then show you how to build your own policy scenario. So up at the top here, if you click emissions, this will provide a full list of different graphs and outputs we provide in the online version of the EPS tool. The specific one I want to highlight first is our CO2 wedge diagram, which both Nathan and I included in our slides. And this is going to show the contribution of different policies to the NDC scenario. So each colored wedge will represent the emissions impacts of a different policy. They're organized by sector. So blue is industry, green is land use, gold is electricity, teal is buildings, and red is transportation. This graph's really helpful because you can see how all the policies combine to meet the NDC target, but also can see which one is like the biggest and doing the most work in the scenario. So in this case, it's this industrial electrification, clean electricity standard, and building electrification. There's a couple other graphs I want to highlight. As we briefly mentioned, we include full economic modeling within our tool. So we use something called an input-output model that can generate estimated changes of GDP and jobs within the state. So this is the expected job growth in the NDC scenario for Pennsylvania. We also have percent change in GDP and other specific outputs. We also include estimates for human health and social benefits. So as fossil fuel emissions reductions go down, we see a reduction in things like premature mortality or asthma attacks. So we created these graphs to kind of visualize the associated public health benefits of doing climate policy. This is the avoided deaths wedge diagram, which shows avoided premature mortality by policy. So you can see in this case, the building electrification policy is really contributing a lot to premature mortality. I'm going to highlight our exciting new hourly dispatch graphs, which I mentioned before is new to this 4.0 version and models an example hourly dispatch for a day. So this is an example average summer day in 2050. And this is in the NDC scenario. So that includes a 95% clean electricity target. So you can see there's a lot of renewables being dispatched. There's some battery discharging. And I recommend, playing around with these new features and new graphs. Some other kind of like good ways to help tell the NDC story is to look at fleet composition of vehicles. So the NDC scenario includes built-in policies to require zero emissions vehicles and then incentivize EVs. And over time, you can see the vehicle stock is transitioning from mostly gasoline vehicles to mostly electric vehicles. This is just one example, but we include, exports. We include everything for each sector as much as we can to try to visualize, changes in service demand, energy demand use, and technologies by different sectors here. I'm just going to flip back to the homepage and then show you how to make a new scenario. So the NDC scenario is preloaded, but you can create your own user scenario, clicking new scenario here, click OK. And then you can start to apply policies on this left-hand side where they're organized by sector. So for example, if you wanted to apply a clean electricity standard policy, you would click on this drop-down for electricity supply, click clean electricity standard, and then use the slider bar to your desired policy level. We can go for, let's go for 70% of clean electricity generation. And then when I let go of the slider, you'll see that this graph will update in real time. So the model is running and updating and creating results for you just as soon as you let go of the slider. We include some information here which describes how best to set this policy, maybe some information on what other states are doing. And then there's links here on documentation and then how to design this policy well. By default, every policy will phase in linearly between 2024 and 2050. So if you want to, let's say, have that electricity target hit by 2030, you can adjust it using this policy implementation schedule. So default is linear, but you can add, click this add button. Say we want it to hit by 2030. We just add 100% implementation by 2030, click OK. We'll see this implementation schedule update. We'll click save, and then you'll see the graph update here. So now the 70% clean electricity standard is hitting by 2030 instead of 2050. And we see, much bigger, much sooner reductions there. That's about it for setting policies. I would recommend creating an account. We offer free accounts to all users, and that way you can save your scenarios, you can give them a name, and you can share them with other people using some of these buttons up here. You're also able to download, with or without an account, you can download all the underlying graph data. So if you want to say, make your own charts in Excel, you're welcome to download the data here, and it'll trigger a download of some CSV files with the underlying graph data. I'm going to stop there, and I think hand it over to Kaylee to lead some Q&A for us.
Yes, thank you all for sending in your questions, and please feel free to continue to do so. I'm going to kick it off with a question for you, Olivia. This one comes from Ken Branson. Does business as usual include policies already in place in a state, or is that existing policy shown with its impacts relative to a business as usual scenario without it? So basically, what is included in the BAU?
Yeah, good question. We do our best to include major state policies. So we include things like state clean electricity or RPS standards, clean vehicle standards. We include things like advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks, if the state has adopted that. We include carbon pricing. So some states have cap and trade or reduced carbon pricing market. We include that. And then I think, am I missing anything, Kaylee? I think that's it for state policies we include. We also include the federal policies in BAU. So that's going to include several EPA rulings, IRA, IIJA, the Inflation Reduction Act I was talking about earlier. So we include as much as we can recently passed federal policies, major state policies. And then if you're interested in adding, an additional state policy that we weren't able to include, we're more than happy to advise you on how to do that.
Thanks, Olivia. Relatedly, we have a question about the businesses. Relatedly, we have a question about retirements in the electricity sector. So from Anonymous, does the electricity module incorporate planned retirements of existing power generation as baseline data?
Yes, we do. We include primarily from EIA's expected retirements. So we're not looking at each individual's state's IRP, but anything announced and in EIA's data with a retirement date, we are including. So as much as we can, we're updating those either annually or semi-annually to keep up with the latest announced retirements.
Nathan, I'm going to pivot to you to ask a few questions about the NDC scenario. So from Sarah Adams, we have, how are the nationally determined contributions determined? Is it by the Paris Agreement? Are there variations?
That's correct. So the NDC scenario and the targets are actually based on the national level NDC Paris Agreement targets with a 2030 intermediate and a 2050 in-state target. And so those targets and those scenarios are actually translated directly to the state-specific models, and they're calibrated a little bit in order to change with some of the state-specific data points. So, for example, for coal retirements, the coal retirement data might look a little bit different across the board, and so the lever that you pull in order to achieve, let's say, 100% coal retirements by 2030 might look a little bit different across the states, but generally it's the same principles and strategies across all the different states. And we actually got some pretty unique results by taking that same national level scenario and actually imposing it on different states. We did not see the same levels of emissions reductions across the board, but we actually saw a large variety based on sort of the construction of the state's inventory. So some states with more electricity might see more near-term emissions reductions, while other states that are maybe more dominated by slower moving sectors had a longer term change. And so this, I think, informed a lot of our insights about setting bottom-up targets across the state level and how to translate national policies into state-specific strategies. So it was a very interesting exercise on moving sort of that national level, high-level strategy into different states.
Thanks, Nathan. Olivia, you gave us that great overview of the electricity sector and those changes. We have a question from Mary Baker. Is there anything related to data center load requirements now and in the future built in there?
That's a good question. No, we don't model that explicitly, like a potential increase in demand associated with data centers. I think if you wanted to model that, that's a great modeling project and a great use of the EPS. Yeah, that would be really interesting, but we don't include that in our BAU.
We have another question that comes from Vimal Amin. Apologies if I'm butchering yours or anyone else's name in here. Let me direct this to you, Nathan. Can a user tweak the historic emissions, for example, to align with the state-specific inventory?
Yes, users can do so, but not on the web app. So if you're getting into changing input data, so let's say, for example, you wanted sort of to integrate web app demand growth, or you wanted to change sort of certain assumptions about how many vehicles or what the electricity system looks like, whatever changes you might want to make, you can make those changes, but you'll have to download the Vensim model onto your machine. And that can be more of an in-depth process of learning. The web app is really designed for that quick turnaround and that high usability, but the Vensim model does have all of the input files. And so if you wanted to go through the process of finding those files, and there's a nice appendix that kind of demonstrates them, and tweaking it, you can adjust it. So in some cases, our team has worked with partners to make sure we get a very aligned and hyper-calibrated inventory with something that, for example, another team is expecting. So we've done that in the past. We don't do it all of the time because it can be rather time intensive, but it is certainly possible. And the whole idea behind this tool is that it can be, it can be changed. It can be reflective of whatever policy question you might have, and it also can be copied in the same framework used across a bunch of jurisdictions. So there are ways to make sure that it is force aligned, although maybe the easiest way to do it is to use the web app and then use some sort of emissions factor or multiplicative after the fact multipliers in order to force align to whatever you're expecting, rather than trying to rebuild the tool in that way, shape, or form.
I'll just add that if you get stuck trying to customize the tool, feel free to reach out to our general email address, which maybe someone could drop in the chat and ask us questions. We're available to help.
Thanks, Olivia. That answers our question from John Perona, which is there any help available for new users beyond the documentation? Are experts available for questions? And so the answer is yes. And we also have some tutorials in the documentation, some video tutorials in the documentation as well. Nathan, I am going to direct this question to you. It comes from Raman Segal. Apologies again for the butchering. How does the power model take care of variability of renewables? How does it ensure there is minimum firm capacity available to support variability in the system?
I think we're gonna have to tap Ravi to answer that question if she's around.
Yeah, it's a Ravi question.
Yeah, happy to. So bit of a complicated answer, but in short, yes, it does. There are multiple parts in the model that decide what and how much capacity should be built. One of those is actually two of them are for reliability. And so the model looks at a peak winter day and a peak summer day and looks at kind of the worst system conditions, including a reserve margin in terms of what demand it needs to plan for. And then it heavily discounts non-dispatchable renewables, looking at their kind of their worst performance over those days to look at their credits to meeting capacity in those hours. And then it goes through 2 steps of building dispatchable resources that are needed to meet load. And if there's additional supply that's needed, then the model will allow both dispatchable and non-dispatchable resources to be built. I think if more detail than that, feel free to follow up. And I know, Raman, you have my email, so happy to talk through it.
Thanks, Robbie. We have a question. I think I'm going to point this to Olivia. It comes from Mary Baker. Are there any restrictions for incorporating data into commercial work?
Like using the EPS models for commercial work? I think the answer is no. The short answer is no. We want them to be, used and publicly accessible. I think just citing them correctly is our major requirement. But Nathan or Robbie, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there's I dropped a link to it. It's released under an open source license, and you can find the license information and the documentation. Kaylee added a link to the documentation in the chat, so you can find it there. And there's a link to the specific license. Generally speaking, work derived from the model that's used for commercial purposes. So if you do your own analysis and then you use that, that's fine. What you're not allowed to do is basically charge people to use the model. And there are requirements on derivations of the model. If you make data changes or model changes, those are required to be made publicly available under the license. And you can find all of that online.
Robbie, I'm going to direct this question to you as well. It comes from James Tilley. How does the EPS handle the BAU scenarios for certain policies that typically change over time, such as fuel economy standards and building energy efficiency standards?
Yeah, so our philosophy in building these models is for policies to be included, they have to actually be enforceable, so legislated and regulated, and or regulated. And so we don't anticipate and put into the model future changes in policies. So if you consider, maybe will EPA's 111 rules be updated, or will air quality rules be updated? Our focus is on what's on the books now and putting that into the model. And so I think the answer to that is no, we don't kind of anticipate, but we do include, for example, we have model year 2027 to 2032 standards from EPA. Those are in the model because they're final standards and they are in the future. But after 2032, we are not making any assumption on what the next set of standards will be. And one related point is we've mentioned targets a few times. So targets are great, but unless they have underlying enforceable mechanisms, we are happy to put them in the models, and you'll see state policy targets throughout the different models for different states, but we don't force the model to meet those targets. They're really, though, that's kind of one of the benefits of the models. It can highlight the policy gap to achieve targets and then help users understand what policy mixes can be used to achieve those.
Thanks, Robbie. We had a great question from John Perona that we get often that you answered earlier in the text, but I'd love for you to repeat it live. So I'm just going to repeat it. It says, can you bottom line distinguish how EPS differs from the En-ROADS modeling program or that are also used by healthy climate advocates?
Yeah, so great question, and one we get very, very frequently, probably partly due to the fact that we both are build and VenSim. Climate Interactive, the model is En-ROADS. For folks who aren't familiar with that, En-ROADS is also a system dynamics model that looks out to 2100 at major global regions and models emissions from fuel combustion and other processes, and also importantly has a climate component, so ties that to warming and other expected impacts. and has some policy framework included as well. So I'd say the two models are complementary, and we work with and speak regularly with the great folks over at Climate Interactive. And so the En-ROADS is really great for looking at kind of warming scenarios and technology trajectories and where large global regions need to be in order to achieve certain warming trajectories, which is not something that the EPS can do. The EPS is really meant at a more granular regional level to look at where we're headed and then how policies influence where we're headed and the emissions and economic benefits and health benefits that come from that. So you can kind of think of it like if you wanted a starting point for where we need to go in order to be in a 1.5 target, En-ROADS would be a good model for that. And then if you wanted to figure out how to build out the policy framework to actually achieve that target, then you could move over to the EPS and do that. So they're quite complementary, and they share some of the same kind of underlying theory of change, but they are a little bit different in what they're designed to do.
Thanks for that answer. Nathan, I'll direct this one to you. It comes from John Pierce. Is it possible to query the EPS programmatically rather than interactively through the web app?
I would say the answer is yes and no. Like we are able to, via Python, get results for a wide range of outputs that then go into the web app. And so, obviously the web app is constructed. Doing that across states is something that we are able to do internally, but maybe a bit more challenging for the average user. One thing that we are considering, though, is to get that entire database of about 8,000 variables per state, multiplied by 48 states, multiplied by several scenarios, public in a database. But that's something that we have not published yet. And so if there's more interest, feel free to reach out. It's pretty straightforward for us to do on our back end, but finding ways to make this more useful, maybe it's in the web app tool or the specific tool or a massive Excel spreadsheet, is one of our priorities. So really appreciate you asking that question.
All right, we're going to take one or two more here. This one I'm going to direct to Robbie from Martin Franz. It says, does the data tool have the ability to layer greenhouse gas handling for modeling via increase in photosynthesis performances, commodities, nutrition, uptick values? So basically, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's a question about the layering of LUCUF policies.
I think, well, let me try and answer what I think the question's asking. So, for non-energy related emissions, the interventions in the model, policy and technical interventions, are tied to some data from EPA on the mitigation potential of different technology interventions in different end use sectors. So one of those would be methane capture and methane destruction opportunities for agriculture or for landfill and waste, and so on. So and then there can be different policies that drive those emissions reductions. So you can have a standard-based policy. So if you think of like a state with oil and gas standards, maybe like New Mexico or Colorado, or you can have a carbon pricing regime that captures non-CO2 and process emissions, and that can also drive it. All that data is in the input data, and then the model is taking that in and making decisions about it based on policies and costs. So this is kind of related to a bigger question, but one nice thing about the EPS is it's very flexible and customizable. So if there's a policy in the model that may not be applicable for your state, you can often repurpose it, provided you have the correct data to then model what you are interested in modeling, and then to flow that through the model. So we're happy to follow up on that offline after this, but there's lots of examples where we've done that with different users.
can just also add that if you're interested in waste and land use specifically, sorry, my voice is going. We draw on EPA for that data. So EPA publish, they're like marginal abatement cost curves for reducing process emissions in the states. And it's linked in our model documentation. And we use all their assumptions on how much is abatable in landfills from EPA.
All right, and I'm going to take one more question and give that over to Robbie. It's from Taylor Binnington. It says, I've never understood how the model Vensum solves so quickly while also relying on economic modeling principles. Could you comment?
Yeah, this is a great question. In the 2 minutes we have left, so the EPS is not an equilibrium model. So it's not, generally speaking, it is not trying to clear markets and arrive at equilibrium. It is kind of an open-ended model. And that the other types of models out there that are least cost or market optimization models, that is where the primary amount of time in those models is from optimizing those markets and solving. We do have some local optimization in the model, and actually in the latest version 4.0, we've introduced some equilibration in certain parts. And as a result, the model runtime has increased a lot. So if you actually run it in Vensum on your computer, it used to take maybe a second or two, and now it's probably up to 30 seconds or more. But the web tool runs much faster due to our great work by our web developer, Todd Fincannon. So that is primarily why it runs so fast, is it's doing a lot less market clearing than other models, and it's not an equilibrium model.
Thanks, Robbie. And I know we're at time, so I would just like to thank you all so much for joining this webinar. We've been so thrilled to have you all and to get to show you a look at the new energy policy simulator models and explain how they have been updated to reflect the IRA era that we are in. Here I've got a last slide just reiterating how the EPS can help accelerate a clean energy future. We've been recording this session, and the recording will be posted on the event page, which is the same one that you use to register within 24 hours of this concluding. And I'd like to thank our partners at Energy Innovation so much for putting this on together with us and for their invaluable technical and intellectual support. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.